Welcome to the end of the world, RELS 357W, week 5. So this week, I want to focus on these 3 New Testament passages from the Gospel of Mark, from the first letter to the Thessalonians, and the book of Revelation. As you focus on these passages, I would encourage you to make sure you have a Bible that you're looking at and you're reading these passages all the way through to get the context. I've heard it said that a text without a context is a pretext. So it's important to figure out, how does a particular verse fit into the larger scope of the passage in which you find it. The second part is you can do that through BibleGateway.com. I recommend the New Revised Standard Version. That's the version that most scholars prefer, or many scholars prefer. I've also given you hints, more than hints actually, places to go like the new Oxford Bible Commentary that's available online through Merriam Library. So the new Oxford Bible Commentary. So to start, I want to look at this understanding of this concept of the rapture, which plays into various films like A Thief in the Night or Left Behind, also, of course, the Left Behind series. And here are 2 key quotes from the Boyer book, When Times Shall Be No More. The first is on this idea of the rapture, which is this moment when Jesus returns and believers will be brought up into the heavens with him, according to the dispensational premillennial thinking. Or according to dispensational premillennialism. I'm going to go into both of those words again in a moment, but essentially there's a big emphasis on this moment, that this idea of the rapture that's in different parts of the Bible. All right, so here's how Boyer says it. One cycle of prophesied events ended with Jesus' crucifixion. This is how the dispensationalists see it. The next will begin with the rapture, the moment when all believers will rise to meet Christ in the air. Once the prophetic clock starts ticking again with the rapture, again, according to the dispensationalists, the people that followed Darby and the Scofield Reference Bible and people who follow that view, this idea of the rapture, the final sequence of events will unfold with dismaying rapidity for those left behind. That's that key phrase that makes it into books and movies. It begins with the 7-year rule of the Antichrist and the Apostate church, the so-called Tribulation. You can read about that or find a Bible verse about that in the book of Matthew, which is the first book of the New Testament, chapter 24, verse 21. Let me just read that for you. For at that time there will be great suffering, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. This is called the Tribulation, of which the second half will be sheer hell. And the Tribulation will end with the battle of Armageddon, when Christ, the saints, and the heavenly host return to earth and defeat Antichrist and his army. Next will come the millennium, Christ's 1,000-year rule on earth, a final doomed uprising by Satan, the resurrection of the dead, and history's final end, the last judgment. So those are all really important components of this dispensational view of the timeline of the relationship between these different events as they read the Bible. All right, then the tribulation, I think, is really important here. This period of great suffering, which is emphasized in dispensationalism. From Boyer, page 172, quote, the theological foundation for these wide-ranging reflections on contemporary global developments with the Antichrist, the evil figure who will rise after the rapture and rule for 7 years, or the tribulation, before his defeat at Armageddon. So the Antichrist is not mentioned much in the Bible. There are different figures that are conglomerated to talk and create this understanding of the Antichrist, this evil figure. Could be some believe a political figure, some believe a religious figure, some believe economic, financial figure, all kinds of different views. But the person, the Antichrist, usually it's a male, he is against what Jesus is about and will cause this kind of rebellion against God's rule that will only be overdone by Jesus' return and defeat of him at Armageddon. Fulfilling his foreordained role, as we saw in chapter 6 of Boyer's book, he will sign a pact with Israel, break it, desecrate the rebuilt temple, proclaim himself Messiah, and horribly persecute those Jews and Gentiles, i.e. non-Jews, who resist his blasphemous claims. This scenario derives from the long-established interpretive conventions involving passages in Daniel, Revelation, and elsewhere. So we've seen these passages in Daniel 7 through 12 especially, and we'll look at Revelation in just a minute. All right, so here are a few key passages. I want to particularly look at this idea of the rapture and this question of when does the 1,000-year reign of Jesus the Christ come? Before he returns to earth, the parousia, or after? And then also, in light of that, when does the rapture occur? If, again, in this reading of the Bible. I'm going to mention in a minute, not all Christians believe that the rapture is really in the Bible. So the first thing to just want to highlight is this idea of the parousia, which is a Greek word for the appearing. And the idea is that Jesus will appear at the second coming in this reading of the Bible. That's what the parousia means. Okay, so in chapter 13 of the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark is one of the 4 Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. They record, these Gospels, the life of Jesus. And when we look at Jesus and we put Christ after him, it's good to remember that Christ is a title. It means Messiah. So here it really is Jesus the Christ. It's not like Jesus Christ, like Christ is Jesus' last name. And I think that's helpful because it gives us a context for what people are asserting about Jesus. In these first 3 Gospels that are in the order of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all parallel a lot of the same stories. And so you can compare them and see how the different writers recount the different sayings about Jesus. Mark, most scholars, or many scholars believe, was written just before the Jewish temple was destroyed. This was actually a rebuilt temple, rebuilt from the temple that Solomon built around 1000 before the Common Era. So in 70 of our era, Common Era, AD, if you will, also, the temple was destroyed. Just before that, it appears that the book of Mark was written. These then were collected sayings of Jesus that were passed on orally. Jesus probably died in 33 CE, and then about 30 years later, after the people who were passing on the oral tradition as you know, the original circle, as it were, died, then they were written down. So in Mark chapter 13, verses 26 and 27, there's a key verse that relates to this idea of the rapture. It says this: Then they that will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. This is the Son of Man figure that you also read in Daniel, this kind of heavenly figure, this final Messiah, perhaps, at least as it was understood in the first century. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So this passage recounts Jesus going to the temple and saying, and his disciples, his followers, saying, hey, look at this amazing building, how well it's built. You know, these stones were so large, they were 37.5 feet long, 18 feet wide, 12 feet thick. I mean, they were amazing. And the disciples are saying, look at this. And Jesus says, it's all going to be destroyed. Which indeed it was in 70 CE or AD. And so here, as you read the passage, you can see the rest of it. There's a part where Jesus says, at some point, this heavenly figure, the Son of Man, will come with great power and glory and gather all those who are the elect, the people, you might say, that God has chosen. We could get into the theology of that, but the ones that God has chosen and who have shown that by, believing in God. So the Son of Man is this heavenly figure that in the first century was the one who was going to bring this restored new heavens and the new earth. And you can read this through the Gospels, but the Christian interpretation in Orthodoxy is that Jesus is taking on this Son of Man, these prophecies for himself. All right, I want to continue. 1 Thessalonians 4:17. So this letter, these are letters that were written from one of the early Christian leaders, Paul, to the early Christian communities or churches. And it's the 4th chapter, verse 17. So, by the way, chapter and verse were brought later during the Middle Ages as ways to help people find passages in the Bible. They're not original to the text. So 1 Thessalonians 4, this letter was probably written, perhaps the first letter written in the first writing of the Bible, probably the early 50s, just less than 2 decades after Jesus' death and his resurrection as reported by his followers. And Paul, as this Christian leader, is writing to the people in this church, this group of this meeting place. We don't have church buildings yet. This meeting place, this group of people meeting who want to follow Jesus, and he's writing them about their concerns about, well, when is Jesus going to come back? Because that was a really important early Christian, teaching. And so he says this, verse 16, "For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the angel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first." So people who have already died, what's going to happen? They're going to rise. Then we who are alive, as believers in Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ, who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. So you could read the whole passage once again, read the context, but I just want to note that even though in this premillennial dispensational view, there's an idea that this will happen, before the millennium, the premillennial view, before the 1,000-year reign of Christ, to finish this dispensation of God's working with people. That is not the only interpretation that Christians take. In fact, most Christians do not take that interpretation exactly. So here's a standard commentary from a more mainstream source, Eugene Boring and Fred Craddock's The People's New Testament Commentary, respected biblical scholars. They comment on this phrase, "to meet the Lord," right? To meet the Lord in the air. It's part of the semi-technical language, they say, used for the arrival of a monarch. A delegation of his or her subjects went out to meet the king or queen and ushered them into the city. The picture is thus not of a rapture in the sense of a modern dispensational interpretation in which believers meet Jesus in the sky and are taken into heaven. Rather, Jesus is pictured as returning to earth as its rightful sovereign, and Christian believers, those already dead and those still alive, are going together to meet him in a triumphal parade back to earth. Those words and pictures utilize common apocalyptic imagery, as in the book of Revelation, that might seem strange to modern eyes and ears, as it in fact did to most of the Thessalonians who had no previous exposure to such Jewish ways of thinking. This is my parentheses. Most of them are non-Jews or Gentiles. And continuing, modern readers, they say, need not take them literally, but must take them seriously. And then finally, in Revelation 20, verse 6, and throughout the passage, we hear and read this, "Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection." So this is this resurrection, this restoration of body and soul together in the new heavens and the earth. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, or of the Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So when does this 1,000 years happen? Does it happen after Christ's return? In other words, Christ's return before the millennium, the premillennial view? Is it at the end of the millennium, the postmillennial view? Or is the millennium more of symbolic language, which would be the approach of many people in the Calvinist or Reformed tradition? Another book Also from an evangelical, also in the sense like the other authors would be evangelical or fundamentalist that Boyer's pointing out. This is from an InterVarsity Press book by Michael Wilcox, The Message of Revelation. He is or was a director of pastoral studies at Trinity College, Bristol. So he talks about premillennialism. Premillennialism is rooted in the belief that the truth of Revelation is basically a literal truth, and this in two respects. First, description is to be taken at face value. It may very well mean, in this passage, a literal 1,000 years. It does mean a binding of Satan and a reign of the saints, such as his helplessness will be unmistakable and their authority will manifest in a way that is never known before. And there's a sequence to be taken as it stands. In the order of history, the binding of Satan will follow the parousia, the appearance of Jesus. Because of the order of the book, chapter 20 follows chapter 19. And you can read about the binding of Satan and the parousia, the appearance of Jesus, in those two chapters. It is agreed that this chapter is the only place in Scripture where the idea of millennium following the parousia seems to be clearly taught. But taking its order seriously means that the sequence of events so unique has just as much authority as the outline given, for example, in Matthew 24 or Mark 13. Therefore, it is to be regarded not as a mere underlining of something already contained in our Lord's teaching in that place, but as an addition to it of extra truth which was there omitted. So the amillennial view is the idea that the Revelation, the book of Revelation, is true, but it holds that neither descriptions nor sequences can be taken at their face value. So much description in the book is symbolic rather than literal. The chain and the pit are not literal, probably then neither are the 1,000 years. And so you'll see this verse, and I believe I've mentioned this in a past online talk, that when Jesus says, "And when I say to you all, keep awake, you do not know the hour or the day." This is from Mark chapter 13, verses 32 and following. Again, verse 35, "Therefore keep awake, you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or the midnight, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. Therefore stay awake." So that's the amillennial view. All these prophecies have been fulfilled, and Jesus can come at any time. And then just post-millennial, let me just read what Wilcox says. "Suppose you do not feel able wholly to accept either of these other two views. As regards the sequent events, the simplicity of the amillennial scheme, with its single day of the Lord destroying evil and bringing history to an end, seems more in accordance with plainer prophecies of the New Testament." And you see the much more complexity in this book of Revelation. So far as the description of the millennium is concerned, however, you side with the premillennialists in hoping for a rather more effective binding of Satan and reign of the saints than most of other Christian centuries would have experienced. You are a literalist to the extent that you look to see Satan chained and the saints crowned, if not physically, yet still in a more obvious way than the vague spiritual binding and crowning in which the amillennialists speak. If this is how you interpret Revelation, you are a post-millennialist. You envision 1,000 years, which may or not be a literal 1,000 years, but is certainly a special period distinguished from the rest of history by the way good triumphs over evil in the course of it. Some have understood this in terms of social improvement. Others, through the biblical emphasis, have looked for a great spiritual advance with the conversion of Jews on the large scale and the gospel, quote, preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come, end of quote, from Matthew 24, verse 13. There will be a single climax to history, the parousia, and it will come after or post the millennium. All right, that's a lot of material. I hope it's helpful, especially if you haven't had a lot of Bible study in your life. And it gives you a context to set some of this premillennial dispensationalism or dispensational premillennial. Let's try that again. Dispensational premillennialism in context. I hope you enjoyed it.